Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm Nate from Incendium. Welcome to the Growth Accelerator. Here with Jaclyn from Starcycle today. Welcome, Jaclyn. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much, Nate, for having me.
So I think the first 2 to 3 questions I should know the answer to. I might limit that just to keep things interesting for me if we can. But if you wouldn't mind giving people the quick rundown, like the 30-second rundown on Starcycle.
Sure.
And you can tell them whatever. So, full disclosure, I'm an investor. I'm a big believer in Jaclyn, what they're all doing. And obviously, we're working together on the growth side as well. So you can just tell them whatever you told me that seems to have been effective, and just dive in from there. we can start the conversation.
Thank you so much. First of all, shout out to you for being such amazing partners throughout this whole thing. It's been a wild ride for sure, but a little bit about us, a little bit about Starcycle. What we do is we help founders shut down their companies. And in effect, what that means is we help you take care of the final mile, the last mile of all the admin, filings, and kind of administrative tasks that go into shutting down a company effectively. So whether that's reviewing your cap table and helping you figure out which investors are going to, how much money they're going to get back, all the way to, filing tax filings and filing the certificate of dissolution with the right state authorities. And this was really born out of my own personal experience with shutting down companies. This is my third company. And so I've kind of been through the ringer a couple times and really realized that, this really is almost like the final mile of a lot of friction that a founder has to deal with. And of course, I love being at the beginning. And I think a lot of people focus their resources and time, and people would like to talk about the beginning because it's exciting. Everything's on the up and up.
Founders are beginning kinds of people, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
that by virtue of, you're doing something new. That's kind of why we all do what we do.
Exactly. And then what people don't talk about as much, and what I got really passionate about from, again, my own experience, but also talking to so many different founders, is what happens when that beginning, once you've taken off, doesn't go the way you want it to. And how do we use that as a springboard to helping you to new beginnings? And I think that's the part I really want to focus on is, helping you go through that process, something that most founders never want to think about, but unfortunately, a lot of people have to go through it, and helping you get through that in a compliant, safe, and kind and compassionate way.
Yeah, and I've shut down companies as well. Had the same experience. I think for one question, maybe before we dive into anything else, so for those watching who are potentially more talented or more successful than we are, why is this so hard? What are some of the things that are complicated? Is this just the worst taxes you've ever done in your life, or what's the experience? What are some of the reasons that make it so tricky?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. The first, and probably the biggest part, is really the emotional reasons behind why you have to shut down. Most folks who have to shut down are doing so not necessarily because they want to, right? And so I think the emotional piece just makes everything so much more difficult, because it effectively, it is a grieving process. You are grieving something you poured your whole life and soul into most of the time. And the last thing anyone wants to do in that scenario is paperwork. And I think the paperwork itself, a lot of the times, 80% of the stuff you need to do is not exactly stuff you haven't seen before. It's tax returns, right? It's reviewing contracts, but it's the additional layer of why you're looking at it. And occasionally, shutting down, it can get a little bit difficult because perhaps you have some invoices you haven't been able to pay, or there's an element of having to go to your investors to have that conversation of, so that bet you placed on me didn't go the way we wanted it to, right? So there's so many aspects that make this process so much more difficult. And unfortunately, you and I have both had some experience.
It's tough. How should we think about or how do you position Starcycle within this? Because I think there's one place to say hey, you got a lot of paperwork you don't want to do, we'll do your paperwork for you. And there's very good businesses that have been built on that. Huge businesses have been built on that. What is sort of the structure around this? And I'm very interested in particular in how this relates to the statement you made, which I think is really interesting, around how you turn this into a launch for something new. How should we think about the business with relation to the degree to which it's just doing paperwork you don't want to do versus actually helping you think about the next steps?
Absolutely. Great question. And I think about this a lot because a lot of the people that come to us are trying to figure out what their next steps look like.
Mhm.
And I think it's a very underrated part of the process that closing out can actually give you that peace of mind, and it will give you that peace of mind to move forward. And, for example, for venture-backed startups, right? I think what makes founders is that we almost never stop problem solving.
Right.
And statistically speaking, a lot of founders end up actually doing second, third, fourth companies. I myself am a testament to that. And so are you, Nate. But if you don't close out what you did previously properly and tie up those loose ends, whether it's, again, vendors or creditors, customers and users that you have relationships with, and investors you have relationships with, if you just kind of dip, right?
Which happens way more than it should, but yeah.
Yeah, it does. And people nobody wants to have a difficult conversation.
No.
But I think it's when the chips are down that really shows your true character. And I think, from my side personally, from what we've seen, the founders who are willing to tackle this head on, even though it is an unfortunate and difficult conversation to have with the people who believed in you, whether it's your team, your co-founders and whatnot, you end up being better for it. And not just from like a legal tax kind of compliance perspective, because of course no one wants the IRS to come knocking on your door several years later, but in terms of relationship preservation, if you show that you are someone who is willing to face something head on and bite the bullet, people respect you for that. And again, this is a very underrated part of the process. And anecdotally, from the venture funds that we've spoken with and that we are partnered with, from investors, institutional and angels alike, a lot of them are like, this is not the first time we're seeing this. And we would rather know so that we can do what we need to wrap this up rather than be in limbo forever and lose that trust, because people talk. Even if you're like, I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do the right thing just so that I don't burn any bridges in the future. That might be in itself a reason to do it. But of course, do the right thing.
And I think in terms of what Starcycle is doing, is it fair to say that like, value prop one would be, we're doing a lot of the paperwork so that you can focus on those difficult conversations? Is there a degree of it just being a catalyst of like, all right, we have a partner doing this and you can kind of keep people on track? How much of the work is those two things versus something else, do you find?
Yeah, so I think the administrative part is certainly a huge chunk of it, of like, we take that physically off your plate so that you don't have to worry about it. And the other thing that we try to support and provide a lot of guidance around is how to have those conversations. And this comes in the forms of templates and, just support in to say when to say these things. Cool. And the other thing is, of course, we're relatively early stage ourselves, and this is a very fresh memory for me. And I make myself available for all the founders that we work with, and hundreds of founders who are looking for someone who gets it. And we are that for them. And what's really exciting and lovely, honestly, about Starcycle is that the vast majority of the team are, of course, founders by virtue of being co-founders of the company, but also have been on that side of the table, who have had those hard conversations. So everyone in the company gets it. And we all have that empathy. And so we're also resources for folks who are looking for that kind of support of like, I know this is the thing I need to do. I just need to talk to someone who gets it. And the way that we look at it is sometimes in your personal life, when you're going through a hard time, like a breakup or a death or some kind of grief you're going through, there's a lot of value in speaking to someone who gets it, a friend who gets it, or looking for community who understand what you're going through. And that's what we try to be as well, is that emotional support on speed dial. And that empathy, that human-centric approach is something we're building into the product. We're like, this is human first. We understand where you are and why you're here. And we want to make objectively a 0 out of 10 experience into, could we say 3 out of 10? I think that's a positive outcome.
That's really good. Now, a couple things. I mean, I do remember an intense feeling of liberation for sure, in the sense that like, I didn't know what would happen on the other side. And it was amazing to find out that like nobody can hurt me, which is like kind of weird. I don't know, from like a Maslow's hierarchy type of view, like actually, like I'm actually physically not in danger because of the fact that and the worst thing that happened is that some people got upset, right? And like one or two, and most didn't. The one thing I do want to say or just highlight here is I actually did find, and I'm just reflecting on my experience 10 years ago without Starcycle and far less experience than I had now. I remember writing out what I would say a lot. And so the templates are really interesting. And I think that could have been very helpful. I think that I probably have focused a little bit too much in terms of thinking about your value proposition on the admin, on the paperwork, which is important. And I think, can't be wrong. And I definitely didn't do it all right. I was paying taxes for years or whatever. And so, but I tried to. But I do think the templates in like some capacity to say, hey, this is the conversation you're going to have with this type of a person. Here's some things that you could say that's really useful. I want to talk a little bit.
That.
Yeah, I want to talk maybe for the rest of the time here actually on something that I found very fascinating working together, which is growth for a business like yours. And it's like the reason I was very interested in investing is that I think of it like a death and taxes business, just statistically like most companies are going to fail, which is fine. Like we've sort of built that into our innovation economy, and we make the numbers work so that everybody is fine there. But there's not a lot of support for how to do it. However, particularly for someone who has like a background in outbound, it's a really interesting thing to be like, hey, you're going to fail. So like call us when you do. I'm like, I think that you've leaned really smartly into some partnerships, which I'd be happy to have you talk about, but I'm interested in what you've learned on the growth side and how that's different than some other businesses you might've worked on. Cool. I was just asking if you could talk first about actually how you've leveraged partnerships. I think you've done that really, really effectively. And then second, just some of the things that you've learned in a really weird outbound value prop. I'm just kind of interested like what that's been like or what you've experienced there.
Definitely. So the way we look at it is really understanding, if you take a step back from the immediate crux of the problem, right? What the challenge really uniquely is that you have to find someone at a very specific acute moment in time. And once you look at it through that lens, rather than, yes, of course, there's a lot of difficult, perhaps taboo conversations around this specific topic, but really the principles of like, how do you find someone who has a very specific moment in time that they can be reached, and kind of applying those same principles. And so how I personally think about it, again, with kind of like my marketing brain, I used to work before kind of and in between founding, that was primarily my background. So this was a relatively easy framework for me to shift into. But if we look at something like wedding planning, right? A lot of the similar types of things and patterns apply. Yes, if you're a wedding vendor, if you're a wedding DJ, if you're a florist, if you have a beautiful location you want to sell to couples getting married, to host on your property, for example, you don't target them for the day of their wedding. There are things kind of leading up to that very specific moment in time that you can that they are open for these types of outreach. Right. And of course, the unique challenge of what we do is, how do you balance something that is objectively most likely going to be less palatable and less exciting than getting married, right? So that is definitely the challenge here. But I think a lot of the principles of how do you find someone in that specific moment before that moment happens, I think that is how I approach it. So what brought, I think our first and early conversations together on how to figure this out was really understanding what are the so-called canon events that happen every time someone is about to or is likely to go through this process, like the shutting down process. And so this is how we approach partners, this is how we approach, outreach, is identifying those other moments that are dots that lead up to a potential outcome that we think might happen to them. And in a very compassionate way, finding different ways to have those conversations. And so partners of ours include different types of investors, include different types of organizations and platforms and whatnot who work with founders in other stages of their business, because most likely there will be someone who is going to look for help once that moment occurs and once it happens to them.
Yeah.
And from a cold email or warm email outreach perspective, it's applying those similar things, but providing value or starting the conversation about something a little bit different that they might be in the mindset to have without explicitly saying, we're here to sell you on a wedding property. It's kind of like, hey, congrats on the wedding, but different.
Well, I think the tone is one difference. One thing I realized as I listened to you talk about this, which is sort of interesting, is one of the advantages of the wedding, if you're in the wedding industry, is if you could imagine a world in which you're in the wedding industry and you are able to gather a list of everybody who got engaged every week. Like that would be really valuable because there's one desired outcome from an engagement. What I think is harder in some ways in this case is that there are numerous other signals that could potentially lead to the dissolution event in 6 to 9 months. But they might not necessarily mean that. And furthermore, it might happen on a different timeline. And I'd be curious to hear your experience with that too. So I think like the wedding example is maybe part of the reason that industry works so well. And I've always admired it. I think they do such a good job. Is they do have some of those signals. But I think one of the bigger challenges is like, I could imagine there are instances where founders are like trying so hard to make it work. And then it's a little binary. And some Monday, you know what, we're just done. And it kind of happens quickly. So I'm interested in like for the partnerships, it seems to me if I'm understanding this correctly, most of your partners are like people who help companies who help people start companies. So how have you sort of approached that, and how have you been able to lock in partnership agreements with good partners that way?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think we position a lot of what our value add, in addition to, of course, the physical list of services we provide, is also allowing a better off-ramp experience for the founders who end up using these platforms, right? So or have relationships with these investors, whether they're, again, institutional or angels. And part of that experience also will inform the last impression that the user or the founder will have of this fund, of this individual person, of this platform. And a lot of what we do is, again, leaning into this idea of like, no one, if you're set up on, if you're incorporating an account, a company, sorry, and you're going through that process of having to cancel that automatic compliance or automatic tax filing or whatever it is, you most likely what drives you to do that outside of you just switching to a competitive product is understandably the user or the founder doesn't want to be doing that. And it's going to be a very bittersweet moment. And one thing that we want to come in and say is this is already a difficult moment for people who are leaving your platform. So for the platforms, we'll help you have those difficult conversations so that whenever these same folks are ready to found again, they remember, oh, wow, last time I worked with Nate or last time I used this product, I actually had a good experience because they were able to send me off to a platform that was able to help us offboard effectively and seamlessly. And they're more likely to come back in that scenario. So that's typically how we approach it. And so again, it's really leaning into an emotional problem. And that really is what drives me to work on Starcycle every day, is that this is not just an administrative, it is not just like an AI data kind of problem. It is fundamentally a human problem. It is an emotional problem that requires a lot of finesse to solve. And I think tech can only get you so far. It's really the experience you craft around it. And so that's typically how we approach these partnerships, is understanding what emotion is driving that specific interaction at that specific moment in time. And the moment in time thing, I think, is very much the red thread throughout all of this, is figuring out, and I have the benefit, so to speak, if you will, of having gone through it myself. I can effectively understand what, or at least empathize with what emotions someone might be feeling at that specific moment in time, and finding the right way to surface help.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, we want these founders to found again. I think that's
correct.
That's a big piece of this as well. Well, and so if anyone is watching this, I guess the one major thing to take away for sure is like, you can fail. You're allowed to fail. In some ways you should.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're trying hard enough, we've done it. It's fine.
Yeah.
You'll be more
if
than
you're
okay.
not failing, you're in some way, shape, or form. I think you're doing something wrong. And honestly, I think people ascribe so much baggage to the word failure, but like every single day you have micro failures, right? An email that you sent wasn't received in the way you were hoping you were hoping it would be, or like all of these things are micro failures, and you don't have to build it up to this giant thing. Shout out to my therapist for helping me frame that.
we all need one. That's great. Where can people find you, Jaclyn, if they want to reach out?
Yeah, my DMs are always open. So just shoot me a note on LinkedIn. I'm first and last name, Jaclyn Siu, everywhere on socials. So at any point you're looking to have a conversation about what's next, we do free consultations, 20 minutes, and you can book those through our website, starcycle.ai. And we're always here to help. We're here to listen. We want to understand and help what you're going through, regardless of where you are in the process. We've helped folks who are on the fence. We've helped folks who know what needs to be done, but almost need an external voice giving them permission and giving them the grace to admit it. And we've also come in midstream. If you're like, I thought I could do this, but I couldn't, there's zero shame. We're here to help. And yeah, we're always only a DM away.
Awesome. Thanks, Jaclyn. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks so much. All right. Thank you, Nate. Talk to you soon. Bye.